Hello and welcome to this presentation on Introductions to Biomedical Research Papers. Now, a lot of very useful information is known about how to write a good introduction, but what we're going to do today is to focus on the rather narrow topic of the roadmap to a good introduction. And roadmap is an excellent metaphor because when you're on a journey and you've got a good roadmap, you know exactly where you are now and how you got here. You know where you came from, you know where you're going to, and you'll even recognize signs along the way to help you to navigate. Well, exactly the same thing is true for our journey through the introduction of a biomedical research paper. So let's take a look at that map. Linguists describe the job of the introduction as creating a research space. And it's a wonderful expression. It tells us that what we're doing is we're defining the area in which we are intending to work. We're driving a flag in the ground and claiming that as our territory, and then we're going to set out and explain that territory or that niche to the reader. We accomplish that in 3 moves, just like moves in a chess game, if you like. And in chess, there's often a very boring opening move. A pawn moves forward a couple of squares. There's a middle game where things get rather complicated and exciting, but then when the end arrives, it's very clear. Well, that's how introductions work as well. Let's talk then about those 3 clear moves in the introduction to a biomedical research paper. Move 1 is sometimes called the handshake, and that's a good expression because it really serves more of a social purpose than an educational or an informational purpose. It makes friends with the reader, and it achieves this by telling them what we're going to talk about in rather broad and simple terms. And that makes the reader feel very much at home and comfortable with the topic. Move 2, like the middle game in chess, is pretty complicated, and it actually consists of 2 steps. In the first step, the author gives us context by talking about previous research. So-and-so did this, somebody else discovered that. And sometimes this can be quite complex for the reader, but the author's doing this for a purpose because they're setting us up for the second step where they say, okay, people have discovered all of these other things, but here's a knowledge gap. Here's something that we don't know. Having identified a knowledge gap in the second step of move 2, the author then in move 3 goes on and says, okay, I'm going to fill that knowledge gap. The purpose of this study is to, and then they'll set out the hypothesis that they are going to test. That's it. 3 steps that take you from a general introduction through a review of previous work to identification of a knowledge gap and the statement that this paper is going to fill that gap. Okay, now let's look at those 3 moves in a little more detail. Move 1, the handshake, consists of 1 or 2 persuasive or anecdotal sentences. Because we're talking about what is known now, the present tense predominates. Furthermore, there's frequent use of what linguists call locative and temporal adverbials. That means we talk about location and time to sort of contextualize the paper. Here are some real examples from articles that you may be familiar with. In the original articles, none of these statements was referenced because within the general field of study, these statements present, well, what's basically common knowledge. Move 2 takes us into consideration of experimentation by introducing previous work, perhaps our own if we're the author, and almost certainly that of others. This move consists of 2 steps, the specific reference to previous work and comments on the limitations of that previous work. The reference to previous work includes actual citations and is often accompanied by reference to the names of particular researchers. For example, Smith et al. Reported that. Or sometimes generic reference to previous researchers. For example, other researchers have shown that. In these examples, note the use of the simple past and the present perfect tenses when referring to single past reports and summary statements, respectively. Step 2 in Move 2 identifies negative outcomes in previous research. For example, however, Smith et al. Failed to identify any cases in which blah, blah, blah. Or perhaps to gaps remaining in our current knowledge. For example, however, it is still not known whether, etc., etc. Probably 9 times out of 10, this step is flagged by use of however, and so we can refer to this as the however sentence. Here again are some real examples from the literature. Move 3 involves clearly stating the purpose of the current research. This may be accomplished by very direct statements such as, the purpose or the objective of this study was to test the hypothesis that. However, sometimes more circumspect statements of purpose are also common. For example, this study describes recent investigations into, etc., etc. Here are some real-world examples of Move 3 statements. Now, I realize that was rather a lightning tour of introductions to biomedical research papers, but don't worry. In future presentations, we'll go back and we'll look at each one of those moves in more detail. For the time being, you want to understand that there is definitely a roadmap to a well-written introduction. It consists of a handshake, a harmless introductory sentence, which normally isn't referenced, a rather complex second move in which all sorts of research is thrown at you, but it's done so in order to circumscribe or to define a knowledge gap. That knowledge gap is usually identified by a sentence beginning with however, and when you see that however sentence, you know that in the next move, in move 3, the author is going to tell you that they are going to answer that question. Got it? If you can remember those 3 moves, then as a reader, you'll never get lost when you're reading an introduction section. You'll never get lost when you're reading a well-written introduction section. And for writers, well, stay with the program. Try not to be too inventive. Make sure that your introduction involves those 3 moves in the proper order. Okay? See you in the next presentation. Bye for now.